So good evening, everybody. So welcome to another Okanagan Print Triennial Artist Talk. So my name is Kelsey and I am the Learning and Community Engagement Curator at the Vernon Public Art Gallery. And as a cultural institution, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge that I'm located on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Syilx people. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Alternatives Funeral and Cremation Services for helping us out at the Art Gallery and sponsoring the Arts Talk series. So tonight, I am very happy to introduce to you Derek Besant. So Derek Besant lives and works in Southern Alberta, and he has worked as the exhibitions designer for the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, was a professor in fine arts at the Alberta University of Art and Design for 40 years, and has exhibited his work extensively on an international level. We were also happy to host an exhibition of Derek Besant's work, The Dark Woods Revisited, at the Vernon Public Art Gallery in 2018. And so a bit of housekeeping before we begin. This artist talk will be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So at the end, once Derek has finished giving his little talk, we will have a short question and answer period. So you can turn on your camera and your microphone and ask Derek any questions, or if you prefer, we can turn on the chat and I can relay the questions that way. So without further ado, a warm virtual welcome to Derek Besant. All you, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Kelsey. As Kelsey stated, I'm one of the Canadian artists in the Okanagan Print Triennial. And it's interesting to have this kind of forum for an international print show out of Canada. And right now, this is one of the premier ones. What I wanted to talk about is the work that I have in the exhibition is word-based and text-based. It has elements of text and image in it. And it's always interesting in terms of an artist and how they get somewhere. How did they arrive there? And I thought I'd track back a little bit into my process, where you would be able to see the things that I have thought about in terms of putting imagery together and how it constructs itself in a lot of ways, depending on what your influences are. And one of the things about the influences of unknowing in terms of language, language is still a very important part of how we communicate, and visual language is interesting because it's operative in the brain on two levels. One is visual information is processed in one quadrant of the brain and reading is processed in another. So the minute that there is text-based imagery together, it creates a bridge for the viewer to try and negotiate and work within. And that's what I call the art equation. So I want to take you back into three things that I have, three examples of objects I've pulled that deal with language and image in interesting ways. And the first one is in terms of artwork and contemporary artwork. Contemporary artwork in Japan in 1858. This triptych was published by a publishing house out of Tokyo, Toyokuni 3. And it is a triptych, so it's 3 panels printed on woodblock prints. Notice the variety of colors. Each one of these things, for those of you who don't know printmaking, has to be done and registered in different plates, different wood blocks. But what is fascinating about this image is that there's a scene, and immediately in a visual scene, as you engage, you start to assemble meaning. But with the triptych, often these were stories where, of course, the beginning and the end are snipped off, and this is somewhere in the middle. And so you have to try and engage. There's a man with an umbrella defending himself against a man with a sword. There's 2 women. It's nighttime. It's by the edge of the water. All of a sudden, all of these elements start to come together and form a dialogue of some kind in your mind automatically. The other addition in here, although I don't write Japanese or read Japanese, it's full of text elements painted right onto the umbrella itself. This obelisk has text information on it. There are little windows printed all over the prints with clues of things, who published it, who printed it, who the artist is, what the story is from. And so these kind of elements also help your eye negotiate around the picture plane. They move you around, they animate it. What I find fascinating with this from almost 200 years ago is the fact that it's akin to the graphic novel of today or the comic book. It's got those kind of characteristics. The panel system is very book-like and part of the history of bookmaking. And so it has a history to it that can be looked at in a different way in terms of contemporary art. How do you use something like this? How does it function? Another object I've got is this wooden panel. And this wooden panel is more formal than the Japanese print, which has a composition that is very animated and you move around on it. This looks familiar in terms of its structure because it's a wooden palimpsest panel from an Afghanistan school. Children in Afghanistan learn to read and write on these type of panels. They're wooden panels and they use a sepia ink, and it's their grammar and learning lessons, script, learning how to write, how to make a language that's very visual. Again, not reading it, I don't know what it says, but it is obviously pictorial in terms of its handwriting. The wonderful thing about these is that if you filled this side, then you could turn it over and you could use the other side. As soon as both sides are filled, they whitewash the whole panel. And so the whole panel, it gets erased in a sense, but not fully. So on this one, there are about 3 layers that I can see emerging up through the whitewash of past lessons, past writings. And so it contains its own history. It's erasing itself, but it's containing itself. And this was an important element in terms of the work that I was making that is on exhibition now and is in the background here for the Vernon Public Art Gallery. The third object I have is a block of maple wood from China, about 250 years old. And it might be a little hard to read in terms of the lighting in here, but it is a book plate, meaning that this was inked up and printed as a page in a book. And the characters that are all in here in terms of Chinese are hand cut in relief so that the top part stays up and that gets inked up with rollers and printed. The interesting thing is, even if you were Chinese looking at this plate, you may have a hard time reading it because the nature of printmaking, of course, is that this is a mirror of what the print is. The print is the final object. So all the writing for this is in fact backwards. It's a mirror image. And yet it creates its own topography. There are hundreds of symbols in terms of calligraphic text in this panel. And it describes its own terrain, if you will, in terms of the artifact of printmaking. And so those 3 objects started me thinking about what is a book. And I had a project that will happen next year for the Biblioteca in Alexandrina at the heart of the Nile, the mouth of the Nile in Egypt, that was about Canadian identity. And one of the things I found with traveling is everybody has an opinion about who we are as Canadians. I run into it all the time. There's an outside perception based on what they see about who we are. And it's a very interesting question. And I wanted to bring that question up in terms of doing an exhibition at the Biblioteca Alexandrina, because it is a world famous, probably the most famous library in the world. It burned to the ground in the 3rd century, but it holds this vast knowledge. It houses 4 museums 2/3 of the building is underneath the Mediterranean Sea, so the humidity factors are of concern. But the idea there is, what is a book? And the idea of Canadian identity started me thinking, well, okay, everybody has this idea of who we are, but who do we think we are? And one of the quotes that came up again from my childhood was Glenn Gould, Bach aficionado, musician out of Toronto, had a famous quote where he said, "The idea of North resides in the psyche of every Canadian." And certainly I grew up with that. I grew up with the idea that there was this vast geography, which we know as Canada. And I grew up living and moving across it. I went to 13 different schools before university in different provinces. So for me, the identity of being Canadian wasn't one set thing. It was more a kaleidoscope of experiences, of types of people, types of geography, customs, heritage. It was all mixed up. Moving around every June, it was measured in terms of distance, the idea of how far and how long it took to get there. Saskatoon to Ottawa, another distance of some kind to another space. It wasn't so much concentrating on what the cities were as much as the distance between the cities. Coming back into Winnipeg, we moved twice there when I was a kid, to St. Vital and St. Boniface, both French-speaking communities. And my education also followed this movement across the country. And one of the things I realized, and it's underlined now during our pandemic time, is that each province operates on its own in a lot of ways. And I found, as experience, that the curriculums were not the same across the country. So as we started to move east from the west, the French got more difficult, but the math got easier. And then when we started to move back, the math got, more complex, and the French got harder. But one of the things that happened was the very same textbook that I had in grade 7 in Ottawa for French was the textbook that I had here for grade 12 in Alberta. So these differences in terms of language and customs, my identity for Canada was the fact that it's very different wherever you are, but it's very unique. And so those kind of things, started to work on me as far as this idea of Canadian identity. I also had one of my mother's sisters, my Aunt Bar, moved from Saskatchewan to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. And my first kind of career move was headed into geophysics before finding. Every time my Aunt Bar would send me a gift for my birthday, would be a rock of some kind. And it was a rock that was either a galena, hematite, or iron pyrites in quartz. These rocks that she would send me in the mail for my birthday gifts were like rocks from the moon. They were this evidence of this place that in my mind existed up in this Northern Territory. And that Northern Territory, growing up as a kid, based on the Glenn Gould quote, of the idea of the North, was a land that was full of magical beasts and vast open spaces that people trekked across in life and death situations. The Northern explorers were, in a sense, horror stories of people trying to find their way across this northern landscape. It was full of wonderful animals like narwhals with tusks and seals and sea lions and walruses and polar bears and Arctic foxes. But it also had this element of the landscape as an important big open space that only certain people knew how to navigate across. And so this emptiness, this vast psychological place in the Canadian psyche, I thought was the place to work from for the work that has ended up in the Okanagan Print Triennial. if it is true still that the North resides in the psyche of every Canadian. The thing I find as an adult, it does reside there, but it resides there as a politicized space that is in change. It's got lots of things attached to it and lots of stories embedded into it. It's like the Afghani tablet in a way that I showed you earlier. And in 2019, I was working in Denmark for the Jutland International Video Festival. And coming home, I flew across the North Pole over Greenland. And below me was out of the plane, was the Arctic. And I was in fall and I was looking down at this landscape and I was reminded of all these stories that my Aunt Bar would tell us about coming out of the North. And so again, though, looking down at the landscape, I started photographing it because it was erasing itself. It was fall, there had been a few snowstorms, the ice was forming around the lakes. You could see evidence of partial roads. You could see the tundra as this open space that wasn't gridded off like we see across most of the rest of Canada, from the air particularly. It had black lakes. It had mountainous areas. It was amazing space, but it was also had all of these hidden things that I couldn't see. I knew there were people that existed down there, couldn't see anybody, couldn't see any towns, but it in itself was this wonderful map, this place. And when I got back home, I printed out the photographs and put them around my studio and started looking at them. And I thought, okay, here it is. Here's what I'm going to work with. It's going to be about the North and looking at this landscape, which is totally hidden in parts, mysterious, resides in the psyche, etc. As I got the photographs going and started to look at them, I thought, but I'm reminded every time I look at these things of all of these stories that come from people who have experienced these kinds of places. And I started to make notes. I started to write down at random things that I remembered that were stories from my family through my Aunt Bar. I started to write out things that I'd done research on in terms of the North. It became this kind of stream of consciousness, bits and pieces of different stories, because they came from all over the place of my experience of moving around to these schools across Canada, still imagining the North there. So the book that I put together, the artist book, which this series is about, is called Arctic Turns. And it's a little bit of a play on words, but it actually comes out to the notion of how this part of our landscape and part of our political landscape is in such change right now. It's turning, it's evolving, it's being looked at in a different light. And how do we maintain this in terms of our Canadian identity? The other thing with my experiences growing up in terms of doing a book about Canadian identity, I had gone to schools that were French-speaking schools in Winnipeg. And so I decided that I would randomly pluck out parts of the script that I'd written and translate them into French. So each one of the pages in the book has an English phrase, English thought, and the opposite signature has a similar thing in French. They are not mirrors of one another. They are reflections of one another. And they go together in a way that is similar to how, when the Japanese print that I showed you earlier, you start to assemble automatically from the pieces and the kind of sequence that they arrive in, a story of your own. And I thought, if I have enough bits and pieces that I can put together, the viewer can maybe resonate with one of them, maybe. I'm going to read you the full book. It's only 8 diptychs, which are 2 panels in French and English. I'll translate it all into English in terms of the French, just for the read of this. But here's the kind of content that's embedded in the landscape. We are obsessed with weather. watching the sky for signs. They came and they came from far, far away. The land that I come from has 2 languages, but you hear more. What if she is beautiful? Seeing is believing. But what if she doesn't like him? Have you ever stepped into 2 oceans? They are never the same. I'd like you to stay. I really don't want you to go. I was born here and I have walked down that road. What are the things that you like? We have this idea of a vast northern country in our minds. I hear you, but I don't understand you. What followed him from there made him stay silent. I warned my sister, it's about to rain. She secretly sent him letters in the mail, unsigned. When she arrives tomorrow, what if she leaves? Her passport photograph looks nothing like her. She washes her hands. But do you understand what I'm telling you? So that is the text that fulfills the body of work for Arctic Terns, 2 signatures of which are on display now at the Vernon Public Art Gallery. And the way that these prints are done, I work in 2 types of technology. I was trained in traditional means of printmaking, so I still employ those and love those and work with those. But I also have developed a long-standing partnership with the Pattison Outdoor Group, Canada's largest billboard company. And they are using all kinds of new technologies all the time, developing ways to get imaging and text out into the public domain. So the paper that these works are printed on is a special backlight paper. It's designed to transmit light through it. It's for outdoor use. It's sturdier than most fine art printmaking papers. And I love the fact that it has this transmission quality. It's a very cold press, even surface, very nice white, beautiful adhesion for printing on, traditionally or otherwise. And I printed on it in terms of the background landscape images with a special UV latex relief ink. And so it sits up in different layers, and you can feel it if you run your hand across it, almost like Braille. And the ink is wonderful because it too is used for backlight signage. So the idea of a flat color, instead of blocking the light, the color glows. The color transmits the light through it. So it has this energy to it. And when I was first working this out, there was a very nice aesthetic to all of that. But then I thought, you know, one of the things that gets me about recounting this experience of the idea of North is there has to be some mystery in it. So I wrote, again, pulling from those written texts, I took 2 other bodies of text and silkscreened the negative spaces around parts of the letters over top completely of the UV latex ink with matte varnish. And then another text level again in a gloss varnish with the positive letters. So the multiplicity of the surface within this book and within these images is very much like the landscape that I was viewing out of the plane, that is the background in the first place, that relates back again to this tabula rasa of partially erased but hidden within itself. And so depending how this is exhibited, it will either reveal or conceal parts of that other text, the full text, in response to the parts you can read. There are parts you might not be able to read. I designed the edition in 7 with 4 bound copies like this of the accordion book, which can be displayed flat or on the wall as a long sequence of images tied together. The 3 other parts of the edition are done in open page signatures so that they are diptychs like this one. And so those can be put together on the wall and cover a whole wall in themselves as well. You can see a little bit here in terms of moving it in the light the other invisible texts that start coming up. You can catch it. And so depending on lighting and museum situation, it will change. What I've designed, because of the paper that and the ink that transmits color through it, what I want to do for the Egyptian show next year is actually have this suspended in the air so that it hangs like a kite tail. And it can be viewed as another kind of object that's moving through space, similarly to how I first experienced looking down at the Arctic from the aerial perspective. So that gives you a little bit of the way that the process for me has worked its way through from the touchstones around me that are not necessarily known right away. I picked up, these different things because they speak to me and they have something. I may not know exactly what it is when I get these things. Some people have given me these things, and they become these mysterious objects, but they work on you, they feed on you. And as an artist, having these things around does influence your work. And so that's where this body of work has come from. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. So the floor is open. If anybody has any questions or just wants to say anything in particular, you can turn on your camera or your mic, or you could say something in the chat.
All right. Thanks, Derek.
Welcome.
Good to see you.
I've got the frozen screen syndrome in terms of what is on the screen here as far as coming in. So I'm only getting parts of this, unfortunately.
So what printmaking technique did you use to do the printing? Is it screen printed?
I'm not getting the full thing here. I think you're asking me about process?
Yes.
The high technology end of it is so constantly changing that when I develop any of these images, one of the first things I do is wait as long as I can before I output it, because the technology changes so quickly. When I was working on 15 Restless Nights for Harbourfront in Toronto, I did that show, which toured across Canada to 8 museums, but I had a touring show in Europe to 4 locations, and I had to reprint a second body of work. When I went back to print, the ink technology, the material, the veils had all changed. So it was a constant kind of trying to work that through. That moves a lot quicker than the traditional things. So even within just having this printed now, the kind of ink technology is all digital, but it's again designed not for fine arts. It's designed for outdoor use in terms of billboards. The traditional means are interesting because they submerge all this. They embed themselves over top, and so parts are only coming through, and I like that. But I'm still working on sets of engravings, etchings, intaglios, silk screens. So it varies. I try to work with combinations of things. I don't know if that answered your question, Linda, because I can't get the whole question here. I'm getting pieces of it.
It did, thanks.
If there's anybody else, now is your chance.
I've got a quick question. Am I coming through okay?
A little bit. Let's try it.
Hey, Derek. Yeah, I was just wondering how you kind of decide with how much to engage the viewer to allow them to think for themselves, but then also kind of the input of what you want the work to do, kind of for your own personal purposes.
Again, I'm getting only part of this, so I'm sorry. So I'm missing kind of gaps in between. On the personal level, and I think that's part of what you're asking, what I'm trying to do with these various series, I try to have several bodies of work on the go at the same time, simply because of changing gears. I find that when I get an idea, it has to percolate, and I often put away, for instance, with the photographs from the Arctic, I put those away for a year and a half before I even kind of really looked at them. And just to get them afresh, you know, to see them in another way. And I respond to a lot of different things. I find that, you know, the idea of language I've been working with for a couple of decades now. And I did a project in Australia in a year ago that was signposts, like when you'd walk out into a big city, and I grew up in big cities, so, well, Canadian cities, when you walk out into a street in the city and you're lost, you're looking for a signpost, and it sends you different places. And so what I designed is a signpost that looked exactly like normal signposts. And I took the busiest pedestrian walkway in Queensland, Australia, right overlooking the Great Barrier Reef. But instead of geographical locations, all the locations were emotional destinations. So people would be wandering around and they'd see the signpost and they'd go for the signpost. But when they got there, there was this other read that would take place. And part of my work, I think, always works with that. There's a kind of other switch, bait and switch. Somewhere there's something you expect to happen and it's different. And so one of the ideas with this was picking up again on this notion of the North. I don't know how many Canadians have explored the North. It's there, we see it, we have an impression of it. It seemed to be an interesting area to explore. Again, particularly now with climate change, development, exploration, all of these kind of things, river systems. I mean, we're hearing that in terms of Arctic terns, the level of plastic particles, even in the northern oceans, is detectable. The polar bear question is up there. So, you know, what happens if the ice starts really melting and doesn't have that longevity where they can get over to where they breed and travel back, migrate, which is about a 7-hour walk across the frozen north. So it seemed important to try and do something that was had a political element to it, but also had a poetic element to it. It's still about art. It's still about an engagement to stir the imagination and locate a person and reach them somewhere and resonate with the work. If that is hopefully part of what you asked. I'm sorry with the technology here. I'm not getting the full engagement.
That's okay. It was. Thank you.
Great. So you have a question from Briar in the chat. On the bottom of your Zoom, you can click the chat button and see it, and I can also read it to you if you'd like. It says, your work has always had a strong sense of narrative, like the Japanese triptych you showed tonight. Can you talk about where those interests came from?
I've gotten the fact that Briar's asking a question.
Yeah. Do you have access to the chat?
It relates to the Japanese triptych?
Yeah, and where your interests have come from.
I can't, I'm not getting it, sorry.
Where your interests have come from.
In terms of the Japanese printmaking?
Yes.
Japanese printmaking is interesting in that it was very widespread to the public in terms of dissemination. The whole nature of what we do is, in terms of print artists, is to disseminate. Toulouse-Lautrec's poster designs were lithographs, were amazing things to get out to the public. And it goes back to the age of the printing press. But Japan is interesting because this whole history of the ukiyo-e, Japanese printmaking, was so technically based and so precise and so beautifully executed in a certain kind of handwriting from a certain kind of time that it's like breaking a code. And as I said, I love the fact a lot of the pieces I have in terms of collecting over the years are individual panels from triptychs, simply because they've been dispersed in a way, they've gotten lost, this one has arrived. And what you have to do is engage into what is the other action going on. In any of this, if we had, for instance, this triptych that I did show, the one example, if just this panel was all I had, there would be a courtesan, a beautiful woman standing out in a wonderfully designed kimono. And if I asked all of you to come up with a narrative for this very print, I'd get a whole variety of different interpretations on that story. So part of it was the mystery of what was going on in these things, because they're taken out of context in a way like the clipping of stills out of a film. And so I like that notion that you have to fill in the gaps. And I know Breyer's work, and Breyer's work is of course interesting because he takes the notion of subject matter as a visual topography and how we think we can read it, but it's actually saying something else. So he is actually, I can see the interest there in terms of his work as a Canadian artist, working with how our perception works on how we read and how we think. And part of that, I think, does come down to looking at these prints from other cultures where you only understand part of it. And you have to literally fill in the gaps.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. If anybody else has any questions, now is your time.
I could have not a question, but an observation on the Derek's work. My camera doesn't work. So, hi, Derek. I love the way you do. Hi, Derek.
Bonjour, Guy.
Hello. I love the way you explain that the viewer have a different interpreting of the story you propose. You don't tell the story, you propose something. And with you give some clue, some element that allows the viewer to make his own story, to adapt himself to what you give to him. I really enjoyed it. It's close to something that I really enjoy.
Thank you, Guy. I think part of that comes out of working in public art installations too, where you have to consider the viewer as part of the equation. It's not just a one-sided equation as an artist, and I think a lot of us understand that. But yes, my hope is that those engagements happen. I had this profound experience back in 1999 with an exhibition that toured, but it went to Buenos Aires in Argentina. And it was the Out of Focus Faces. It was one of the first shows of that body of work. And I had people actually weeping in the exhibition, coming up to me and telling me stories of the fact that the portraits reminded them of people they knew. And Argentina had just come out of the dirty war of the Falkland Islands, and everyone had lost someone. And it's like the time we're in now, you know, it's kind of unreal to consider the amount of people who are whose lives have been changed by what we're dealing with under the pandemic. And but that taught me something. It taught me something in terms of my shows. It wasn't just about putting works on the wall. It was making some kind of connection in a foreign place in terms of or at home, but in a real way to someone else's experience. That night at the opening in Buenos Aires at the Centro de Arte Moderno, I got enough stories back to write a book from people that were just responding to the work.
Yeah.
And so that narrative has always been something I've wanted to work with, and more in a lot of ways.
That's what I was thinking. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy.
Great. And how's your time, Derek? Would you like to see if
I'm fine.
another question? Okay.
I'm just sorry there's these gaps because
It is what it is. Great. Well, if anybody has any other thoughts or questions, now is your time. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Derek. It was a pleasure to have you tonight.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all of you who tuned in.
Great. Yeah, so we will be posting this video on our YouTube probably in the next couple of days. So feel free to share it to anybody else who you think may be interested. And we have our next artist talk on Thursday. So stay tuned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.